Before I begin my review, I want to point out that this was Adolf Hitler's favorite movie. Now that you have that uncomfortable information in your head, I will press on. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs actually wasn't the first animated film ever made, as many people believe, although it was one of the first. Only a couple of full-length animated films have been made up to that point, and those were several years earlier in Europe. So Snow White was the first American full-length animated feature, and the first one was about as good as anyone could have hoped for. Snow White and the Dwarfs continue to be popular figures in pop culture, and after nearly 80 years, Snow White continues to be one of Disney's most recognizable films. And it would be different if Disney didn't make so many great movies after Snow White, but they did. So that's a testament to the film's ability to make an impression on audiences. It's amazing that after so many years, Snow White remains just as timeless as ever. Even though there were elements in this film that make it feel a little dated, it still feels more timeless than even some of Disney's more recent works. And I think you could say the same thing about most of the films that Disney made while Walt Disney was over production. One thing I was surprised about after seeing Snow White again was how very simple the film is. It's only about 80 minutes long, and Snow White doesn't even meet the dwarfs until the film's halfway point. And not much happens throughout the entire thing. The story is nearly universally known. Snow White's stepmother, the Queen, is obsessed with being the fairest maiden in the land. So she often speaks with the magic mirror so that it can confirm to her that she is indeed the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. However, when the mirror tells her one day that Snow White has surpassed her in beauty, she orders a hunter to take her into the woods and kill her. However, overcome by her beauty, the hunter simply can't do it. He tells Snow White to run away, and she does so, setting off a chain of events that leads to Snow White meeting the Seven Dwarfs. The story is more basic than probably anything Disney's done recently, but it still manages to work. And that's because while neither the plot or the characters are very deep, the film still manages to tell a good story of good versus evil. And sometimes, when done right, these simpler stories stick in our minds more, because we don't have to think about what's happening as much. We only need to relax and let the film take over our imaginations. And getting absorbed into this film was a great experience. And it is an absorbing experience. Because it's so different from today's films, and it didn't require me to think very much, I was able to just sit there and get absorbed into it. And when it was over, I had nearly forgotten that I was watching a movie. Ironically, the thing I just praised this film for being is also probably the film's biggest flaw. It is so simple that not a lot of it truly stands out. Don't get me wrong, the character designs are great, especially Snow White, Dopey, and the Evil Queen's disguise. But from a character standpoint, there isn't anything that interesting about them. There isn't a bad character in the film, but there isn't a very good one either. From a personality standpoint, Snow White and the Queen are nowhere near the top of my list of greatest Disney heroes and villains. Again, they aren't bad, but I found myself caring about Snow White, but not nearly as much as I've cared about some other Disney characters. The simplicity of the story also hurts it a bit, I'm afraid. While very absorbing, the story is so simple that it just doesn't leave a big impression on me. It's a good story, but due to the simplicity of it all, it isn't a film with a lot of rewatchability. Now, I'd be lying if I said that the story wasn't hurt by it being the first animated feature film, but I'm reviewing this film as it stands today, and not how it was in 1937. While the dwarves individually aren't very interesting, they play off each other very well. There's a scene with some pretty good slapstick involving the dwarves right before they meet Snow White, but even though that is good, I've seen better slapstick out of Disney. And yet, despite the simplicity of it all, and despite the fairly weak characters, Snow White is still a very memorable film. The scene where the Queen gives Snow White the apple is one of the most recognizable scenes in all of Disney, and it's very impressive that the animators were able to create such a memorable figure in pop culture on their first attempt. Before I get back to some positives, I want to bring up one more negative. I really didn't like Snow White's singing voice. It just didn't sound right to me. However, her regular voice is fine. It's pretty well known that Walt Disney held Snow White's voice actress to a strict contract. Since he wanted to make her voice special, the actress who voiced her couldn't work in the professional entertainment environment after doing Snow White. However, she did get an uncredited part in The Wizard of Oz. She sings the "Wherefore art thou Romeo" line in the song "If I Only Had a Heart." For the first full-length American animated feature, the animation seems pretty impressive. It pales in comparison to today's, but it's remarkably good when considering the time when it was made. And while I wasn't ever really scared while watching it, this film apparently terrified audience back when it first premiered, especially children. Most animated features at the time were fairly innocent, and Snow White was pretty dark in comparison. But audiences loved it. In fact, they loved it so much that it became the highest grossing film of all time during its initial release, and kept that title until Gone with the Wind came onto the scene. Walt Disney was also presented with a Special Academy Award, which has to be the coolest looking Oscar ever given out. It was one regular-sized Oscar, along with 7 smaller-sized ones, representing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, of course. There's actually a YouTube video showing Shirley Temple presenting the Oscar to Walt, and it's really fascinating to watch. And the film was also critically acclaimed. In fact, Sergei Einstein, director of Battleship Potemkin, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, called Snow White the greatest film ever made. There isn't one voice actor in the film who I thought did a fantastic job, although the voice of the Queen was pretty good as the old lady. But besides Snow White's singing voice, I liked all the voice acting in this film. It's hard for me to name a favorite character since there isn't really one that stands out. However, I think my favorite would be Dopey the Dwarf. Out of all the dwarves, he's the one that made me laugh the most, and he's also a really likable character. My favorite scene in the film is probably the scene when the Queen transforms into the old lady. Even today, that scene feels pretty creepy, and I liked how the Queen's laugh turned into an elderly woman's cackle as she transformed. Overall, I've got to tip my hat to Walt Disney. It was an incredibly bold move to produce a full-length animated feature when literally none of them were being made. And for a first attempt with a relatively new medium, the result is nothing short of miraculous. Keep in mind that I'm reviewing this film, and all of Disney films, without taking into account the release date as far as the story or characters are concerned. If I looked at this as the very first animated film ever, I give this movie an A+. Keep in mind that in the year 1937, motion pictures weren't very deep, and the characters weren't very great, at least not nearly as often as they are today. Filmmaking as a storytelling medium would only continue to improve, so for the very first American animated film, it's about as good as anyone could have hoped for. And even though the story and characters are hurt by it being the first feature, they're still pretty good, especially the character designs. And this won't be the only time I praise character designs in a Disney film. So, I suppose I need to rate this film twice. If I take the release date into account, then this film gets a perfect 5 stars out of 5. For 1937, nobody could have hoped for better. And for the year it was released, the story and characters were actually pretty good, and not even seen as simple. However, if I do take the release date into account, I'll give Snow White 4 stars out of 5. It's a masterpiece, but a film that didn't reach the heights that some of the later Disney films eventually would. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.